Welcome to the Dough Roller Money Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Berger. Today, we're going to talk about, stimulus checks and unemployment benefits and aid to state and local governments. We're going to talk about the next stimulus package. I'm going to share with you kind of where things stand. I'm recording this on August 30th. Yeah, August 30th. You know, when you're sort of semi-retired, the dates and days of the week don't really seem to matter much. Anyway, I'm pretty sure it's August 30th, and I'm pretty sure it's 2020, and I'm pretty sure this is the Dough Roller Money Podcast, and that I'm Rob Berger. If I've got all of that right, we're going to be talking about the stimulus package. I'm going to kind of tell you where things stand, my thoughts on it, and where I think things may go. And as I record this, I'm going to, just bear with me for a second. If you're watching the video, you saw that I went and closed the blinds in the room where I record. This is basically Dough Roller headquarters. Well, not anymore, but kinda. And anyway, it seems like it's been forever since I've recorded a podcast. It really hasn't, but it feels that way. And so I am just going to kind of give you an overview of where things stand, not just on if you go to the internet and you search for something like stimulus check, and I can tell you from firsthand experience that millions and millions and millions of people are doing that every single day. It's like everyone's waiting for that next sign that we're going to have a stimulus deal. And I get it. A lot of people are struggling. But I can tell you, at least as of August 30th, there's not much new to report. As you probably know, negotiations broke down or came to an end on August 7th. We had House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Minority Leader Senator Chuck Schumer from New York. They were representing the Democrats in the negotiations. And then you had Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary, and Mark Meadows, who former congressman, but is now Chief of Staff at the White House. They were negotiating on behalf of the Republicans. When things broke, or when negotiations stopped on August 7th, here's where the parties stood. For the Democrats, of course, they passed the HEROES Act in May. It was a $3.4 trillion package. That is huge. I mean, just to put that in perspective, that's roughly would represent every dollar the federal government brings in for an entire year. We only spend about $1 trillion more than that. I mean, defense is under $700 billion. I mean, $3.4 trillion is ginormous. The CARES Act, by the way, which passed earlier in the year, just by comparison, was about $2.2 trillion. That was like 3 times as large as the relief package passed after the financial crisis in 07, 08, 09. So the CARES Act was huge. Of course, we're obviously in an unprecedented time right now. But in any event, the HEROES Act, $3.4 trillion was huge. Senate Republicans introduced the HEALS Act at the end of July. It was $1 trillion. Also quite large. Obviously, I guess today we're talking about numbers so big that, $1 trillion doesn't seem like all that impressive, right? It's like, $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there. Pretty soon you're talking real money. So during negotiations, here's how negotiations played out. And I listened to just about every press briefing by the 4 I just mentioned on C-SPAN after every day of negotiations. And I did that largely for my writing for Forbes. So unfortunately, I know more about this than, frankly, any normal person should. But here's by and large how the parties are negotiating. They're taking 2 very different approaches. The Democrats are saying, look, let's just focus on the top line number. Let's agree on a top line number, and then we'll get to the details later. They're important, but let's get an agreement on a big number first. And that caused them to say, hey, we'll shave $1 trillion. Again, I kind of laugh when we talk about, $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there, but that's what they said. We'll shave $1 trillion off of our $3.4 trillion package. If you add $1 trillion to your $1 trillion package, that still leaves a $400 billion gap, and we'll just have to figure it out. What the Republicans said is, wait a minute, this is not the way we want to negotiate. We want to actually get into the details. Here's what you want for unemployment. Here's what we think we should be at. Here's what you want for aid to state and local governments. Here's what we think you should be. They sort of wanted to take it line item by line item. And so they came up, actually, on some of their proposals So I think some could argue that some of their initial positions were not realistic. And by the way, the same could be said of the Democrats. But they came up on specific issues. So, for example, they were at $200 in enhanced unemployment benefits. Remember, the $600 benefit expired at the end of July. Their initial proposal was a little more complicated than that, but for our purposes, they were at $200. The Democrats wanted to continue the $600, so Republicans said, well, we'll come up to $400. And same thing for state and local aid. The Democrats wanted $915 billion. That was part of the HEROES Act. The Republicans had nothing in the HEALS Act. They weren't going to, at least for that type of state and local aid. They had other provisions, about $100 billion for education. Anyway, they came up to $150 billion from zero. So they were wanting to sort of negotiate on a sort of line item basis. And then, of course, obviously that would roll up into one number, but that was their approach. And so not only could they not really agree on the specifics, frankly, I don't know that they ever saw eye to eye on how they should approach in general terms the negotiations. Okay, that's all up through August 7th. Now, I'm sure you know, on August 8th, President Trump signed 4, people call them executive orders. There's actually only one executive order. The other 3 were executive memoranda. For our purposes, I don't think it much matters. But here's what he did. He extended unemployment benefits at a $300 a week level, but it's temporary. So the way this works, as you probably know, but maybe not, the president can't just start writing checks, right? It requires Congress, and specifically the House actually, to appropriate the money that would allow the executive branch to actually spend it. You can imagine, it's almost like, someone else controls your money and they give you some to spend. And once they give it to you, there may be some parameters on that money, but you can then go ahead and spend it. And that's kind of how it works in our government, that old pesky checks and balances thing. So he doesn't just have an unlimited bank account to spend money. So what he did on the unemployment was he took money from FEMA. He said, look, this is a national emergency, and it has actually been declared a national emergency. But there's a limited amount of funds. So it's probably not going to last more than a few weeks, but states have slowly been rolling it out. I've been covering this on Forbes. So that was the first thing he did. He extended student loan relief to the end of the year. And that's actually been put out now by Secretary DeVos of Education. And it includes no payments, no interest, and the non-payments, if you will count towards loan forgiveness programs. There was an eviction moratorium. It's much narrower than what was in the CARES Act. And again, it's because a president has limited powers. And then he introduced a payroll tax holiday that I personally think is a bunch of hooey. I think it's ridiculous, if you really want to know how I feel about it. But, it'll have, he's introduced it. The problem is it doesn't eliminate the liability, the obligation. The employee still owes the money. It's just that it defers it until the beginning of the year, and it creates a hassle for employers. But in any event, that's what he did. Well, since that time, as you probably know, both the House and Senate went on recess. The House came back for a Postal Service vote. I won't even get into that issue. They came back for a Postal Service vote, but they're basically on recess till after Labor Day. There still, however, have been some I'll put it negotiations in air quotes is what I'll call it. There's been some back and forth kind of between Mark Meadows and Nancy Pelosi. And there's actually been some progress. You wouldn't know it. It's kind of, I'll call it stealth progress. So remember, when talks broke off, the Democrats were at $2.4 trillion. The Republicans had made some offers on some individual items, but we didn't really know what the total package cost that they were offering. So as far as we knew, it was still around the $1 trillion proposal in the HEALS Act. Well, since then, 2 things have happened. The first is Nancy Pelosi has come out and now offered $2.2 trillion. So it's down $200 billion from where she was. And Mark Meadows has now said, and this is just recently, that the president would sign a $1.3 trillion stimulus deal. So Democrats have come down, I guess, another $2 billion. Republicans have come up, at least according to Chief of Staff Meadows, $300 billion. So on the one hand, they're still far apart, right? 2.2 trillion versus 1.3 trillion. So that's what? That's 900 billion. I think that's still a pretty big number. But on the positive side, they have narrowed it by a half a trillion. Again, these numbers are so large, it's like I almost can't say them with a straight face. I mean, it's just unreal. By the way, that's not to say that they're good or bad. It's just that they're really ginormous. I mean, we're probably looking at least, I'm going to guess, $4 to $5 trillion in relief spending when it's all said and done. And that's just through this year. That's more than the federal government spends an entire year. I mean, we're going to be increasing our debt, oh my goodness, by, I don't know, 15 to 20% probably when it's all said and done is my best guess. But in any event, that's kind of where we are now. 2.2 trillion versus 1.3 trillion. Now, that's still a big gap to cover, and folks are desperate for help. There have been some positive signs in the economy, but still, I mean, look, unemployment's still hovering around 10%, and we're obviously nowhere near what we would think of as normal life. And so the question now becomes, how and when do they narrow the gap? And of course, it's a presidential election year. I won't even get into that, of course, because that's just too political for this podcast. Other than to say, it just adds tension and stress and tactics and positioning, whatever's normal in Washington magnified by 100, right, during a presidential election year. I think particularly as one as contentious as we're likely to see. So how do we bridge that $900 billion gap? Well, I actually think, and by the way, if we do, what will be in the final package? Those are the two questions I'm going to try to answer for you now. I actually think there is a fairly easy way, actually, to bridge the gap. The biggest line item representing this gap is aid to state and local governments. Under the HEROES Act, the Democrats want $915 billion, and at least so far, what Nancy Pelosi has said is, yes, we'll bring the total dollars down. She's down to $2.2 trillion, but we're not compromising on that $950 billion number. It absolutely has to be part of the $2.2 trillion. There's actually some good news there, I think. By the way, the Republicans, at least last they disclosed it, were at $150 billion. And it's this. And I spent countless hours researching this. I've talked to economists on this issue. There's not a single economist, liberal, conservative, in between, that supports $915 billion. I think when the HEROES Act passed in May, there was at least one at Upjohn who had an estimate of state and local budget shortfalls that was around $950 billion. He's since come way down. And the reason he's come way down, and I actually talked to him, the reason he's come way down is because the unemployment outlook, while still bad, is not as bad as it was then. So his current number is around $774 billion. Still a big number, but well below 915. And he's an outlier. And by the way, that's not their current need. That's their need for over the next 2 to 2.5 years. They don't need that right now. That's the projection of what they will need. If you look at if you throw out sort of I'll call it very progressive, if you will, and then throw out the very conservative estimates, what you find in the middle, Moody's Analytics, I think, is probably one of the most highly regarded in this field. They come out at $500 billion. It's not what the state and local need right now, but what they're going to need over the next couple of state fiscal years, which tend to end June 30th. Most states' fiscal years end June 30th. So what they are going to need, both because of budget shortfalls and increased Medicaid spending, is about $500 billion. And that gives me some hope. I mean, even if we agreed at $500 billion, and I'm not suggesting the Republicans would come up that high, that would shave $415 billion off of the Democratic. I mean, that takes us to $1.8 billion right there. And the reality is, we probably don't need $500 billion. For starters, again, that's for the next 2 to 2.5 years. We don't need to solve the next 2 to 2.5 years. People need money right now. Now, I don't know if the Democrats will see it that way. Well, let's put it this way. I know some Democrats see it that way because they've written open letters to Nancy Pelosi that have said, look, we got to do something here. And the approach we're taking as Democrats right now is not working. Now, how she'll handle that, I don't know. And of course, it requires the Republicans to change their position as well. But it gives me hope because you could have a package that's at 250 billion, 300 billion for state and local governments that would more than offset their budget shortfalls for the next year. May not permanently solve the problem after that, but of course, who knows? I mean, things could get better over the next year. Things could get worse. We have time to deal with that. And frankly, that issue alone could bridge the gap or a big chunk of it. I think the other issue is unemployment benefits. And by the way, I will acknowledge that what I'm about to say may not be popular for some of you, particularly if you're unemployed. But the reality is, I would say most of the sort of experts don't support 600 at this point. There are certainly left-leaning and right-leaning economists that take I won't call them extreme views. I don't think they're extreme, but you'll certainly find those that say, yeah, we still need 600. You'll find others that say we only need maybe 200. But there was a report put out by the Aspen Institute that was written by a group of 4 economists from both sides of the aisle. Had Timothy Geithner, former Treasury Secretary for Obama, had folks that are more conservative, and they did a thorough analysis. It's quite good, actually. And what they said was $400 a week. Their formula is a little more complicated than that. It could actually end up being less than that. But they had a formula based on the rate of unemployment with a maximum benefit of $400. And the fact of the matter is that replaces almost, not quite, but almost 100% of most workers' lost earnings. The $600 level, unfortunately, what it does is it replaces about 134%. In some cases, about 20% of the cases, it actually doubles a person's income as compared to what they were making working. That was fine for a short period of time when we were in the, trying to figure all this out 6 months ago. It doesn't make much sense anymore. Obviously, if you're unemployed, you want to get as much as you can get, and I understand that. But from a policy perspective, I really think 600 is a hard sell. And I think the Democrats can get there. I certainly know many Democrats can. I don't know if Speaker Pelosi will. But I think if there's compromise on those 2 issues, and if the Republicans are willing to come up a little from their $1.3 billion, I think an agreement can be reached. My guess, I'd put it somewhere in $1.5 to $1.8 billion. By the way, still a truckload of money and something that we're going to have to deal with eventually. I hate the thought, frankly, of burdening our great-great-grandchildren with more debt. But maybe that's a topic for another podcast. I think agreement can be found there somewhere. And it would include a stimulus check, probably $1,200 and $2,400, just like before. I think the one difference would be there won't be age limits on dependents. So if you have, say, children in college, they would probably qualify if they're dependent. And even adult individual, maybe you're taking care of a parent or something and they're a dependent. I will say, as popular as stimulus checks are, they're a really bad way to actually distribute money. And the problem with them is they go to folks regardless of need. The last one went to, say, married couples making up to 150 grand. So if you're making 150 and you haven't lost your job and, economically things are just no different for you, you still get a check. Now, I'm never one to turn down money. Don't get me wrong. But again, from a policy perspective, it would be better to put that money into unemployment, state and local aid, payroll protection program, in my opinion. But politically, it's probably going to be in that package. And there will absolutely be enhanced unemployment benefits. I'm guessing 400, but who knows? It'll definitely be in there. And there will certainly be some level of state and local aid. At first, that may not seem, it's not money going directly to you and me, but it is critical. And I'll kind of end my discussion of this and this podcast with this. It's important to understand state and local governments cannot borrow money for operations. They're not allowed to. Most of the states have balanced budget amendments. They can borrow to build a road or a bridge or something, but improve a park. But they can't borrow to fund operations, whether you're talking about the school systems, firefighters, police officers, whatever. And so when they have a budget shortfall, whether it's because people aren't working, so income tax go down, people aren't buying, so sales tax go down. People can't afford their mortgage, so they're not paying real estate taxes. Their only option, apart from getting aid from the federal government, is to cut. And that ends up you end up getting a lot of unemployment. You go into your child's school in the third grade and you see that there's twice as many students in the class as you're used to, and maybe that even union rules permit. And the answer is, yeah, but we had to make cuts. We don't have the funding. So it's a pretty serious issue, and it will have serious impacts on the GDP of our country. Now, I'm not suggesting the federal government should necessarily make up 100% of that shortfall. States do have rainy day funds, believe it or not. And the fact that they can't borrow forces states to have rainy day funds. And most states had pretty healthy rainy day funds going into this. But of course, that can get spent very quickly. And there should be some belt tightening. I'm not suggesting the federal government should cover it all, but they're going to have to cover a pretty significant chunk of it, or the consequences for us, I think, could be quite severe. So when it's all said and done, here's what I'm going to give you a prediction. Now, remember, I predicted interest rates would start going back up in 2010. In the next podcast, I'm going to talk about the Fed's recent policy change. I call it Rob Berger is an idiot when it comes to interest rates policy change. I don't think Powell gave it that name, but he certainly could have. And I have no idea what I was saying. Yeah. So that's for the next episode. But what I would predict, nevertheless, given my terrible track record, is that we will have a stimulus deal sometime in September. By the way, just to add more intrigue, there's the whole shutting down the government at the end of September if there's not a continuing resolution. And so whether the folks in Washington try to use that as leverage, I think that's a silly game. And whoever tries to use it as leverage, it always backfires on them. So I think there will be a stimulus deal in September. I think it will include a stimulus check. It will include enhanced benefits for unemployment. It could actually be $600. If I were guessing, though, I would say less, certainly not less than $400. And there will be aid for state and local governments. It'll be more than the $150 billion that the Republicans are currently offering. I think it'll be $250, maybe $300. That's my guess. I think that's going to happen. Now, hopefully this episode gets published before the stimulus bill actually gets passed. I think it will. And you're welcome to join the Dough Roller Facebook group, doughroller.net/Facebook group, so that when I'm proven just terribly wrong with this prediction, feel free to light me up in the Facebook group. I would appreciate it if you were somewhat kind, but please make fun of my inability to predict anything. I would be happy for you to do that. So that's my prediction. That's the status. Hope you're doing well in COVID-19. I feel for the parents who now have become teachers. You're now all teachers. Welcome. As we try to do all this stuff from home, and that's just around the corner. But I hope you're hanging in there. I hope you're staying safe and healthy. And like I said, in the next episode, we are going to talk about Fed policy and what that means for you and I in terms of investing and whatnot. One last thing, you notice I didn't give you the podcast number at the beginning of this episode. It's because I've given up trying to remember what the podcast number is. Oh, I'm something. But it's a big number. I know that. It's not, I can tell you it's not 1.5 trillion. We haven't done that many shows, but I'm sure it's over 300. Hey, until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.